Hello, everyone, and welcome to Puritan Preaching, where we seek to encourage you to preach one Christ, by Christ, to the praise of Christ. And what you might notice straight away is we're in a bit of a different setting here today. I'm in beautiful Ireland for my holidays. That is actually where I live. But we managed to get a couple of weeks away in a beautiful town in Ireland here. And my wife was very kind to give me some space to record this video for you. And what we're talking about today is Puritan Bible translations. There's a lot of Bible translation nerds out there, a lot of people interested in Bible translations. I myself am one of them. I love Bible translations. I have multiple different Bible translations that I will use in my study and also use to read for my pleasure. I'd be interested to know what Bible translation you use and why you prefer to use that. For me, and Passage Baptist Church in Cork, where I preach, we choose to use the ESV. It is very good in terms of readability, but also in terms of accuracy, and that's one of the reasons I love it. But there are multiple great translations. I love the freshness of reading the CSB, for example, a newer translation. I love the joy of preaching from the King James Version. Sometimes I'm invited to different churches, particularly in Northern Ireland or different places where I might preach from the King James, and what a beautiful Bible translation it is to preach from. I'd be interested to know what your favorite translation is and why. But today, what we're going to look at is Puritan Bible translations. What were the ones that they read? What were the ones that they preached? What was the history leading up to their Bible translations? That's what we're going to look at now. That's what we're going to turn to in this video. So let's go there now. Okay, so let's look at this. What Bible translations did the Puritans use? And the answer, it may actually surprise you. If I asked you what Bible translation the Puritans used, you would probably say, and most Christians would probably come to the conclusion, that the Bible that they used was the King James Version. That answer is partly true. It is half true. Yes, it is true to say that John Owen, for example, preached from the King James Bible. It is true to say that Thomas Watson himself quoted the King James Bible. It is true to say that John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was filled with its imagery. But the Puritan movement began long before the 1611 translation came. In fact, for the first 50 years of the movement, there was no King James Bible at all, depending on where you want to start the movement. So what Bible was it? Well, to answer that question, what I'm going to do is travel back a number of years to begin with this idea of Bible translations and how it came to be in the English language, first of all. So let us think about the Bible before the English language. Obviously, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the Greek Bible, translated first into Latin, into the Latin language. The Old Testament was originally written, as you might know, in Hebrew and small portions in Aramaic. And in around 250 BC, Jewish scholars living in Alexandria began translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, starting with the Torah and then moving across to the whole of the Old Testament. And that translation became known as the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. And why does this matter? Because when the New Testament writers quoted Old Testament, they were frequently quoting the Greek translation, the Septuagint itself. And so the Septuagint became the Bible of the early church, of the expansion of the early church. And then in around 1400 AD, AD 1400, Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, and his translation became known as the Latin Vulgate and remained a definitive Bible for many Christians for hundreds of years. There was just one problem, however, with this translations. For as the centuries passed, ordinary people no longer understood nor read Latin, nor were able to grasp its truths. And so the Bible became a Bible for the hierarchy, for those who were high up in the church, and less so for the common people. And that needed to change, and eventually it did, and thank the Lord it did, because from this came the first English Bible. John Wycliffe's dangerous dream, you could call it. In the late 1300s, an Oxford scholar named John Wycliffe became convinced that every Christian should have the Bible in their own native language. And this he sought to have in English. At a great cost to himself and to his followers, he sought to translate the Bible into what is known as Middle English. It was the first complete English Bible. However, the issue with this English Bible was it was translated not from the original languages, but from the Latin Vulgate. But it was a great work that Wycliffe started, and a great work that was part of the English Reformation itself. His followers, known as the Lollards, carried handwritten copies across to England, risking imprisonment, risking death for the sake of spreading God's word. And the idea was now alive for a Christian Bible in the English language. And this is where William Tyndale came, the man who gave England its Bible. If Wycliffe planted the seed, Tyndale grew the tree. In 1526, Tyndale published the first English New Testament translated directly from the original Greek. And later he translated much of the Old Testament directly from Hebrew. And his work fundamentally transformed not just the Bible, English Bible, but transformed the English language. And phrases that we use even today came from Tyndale's genius. Let there be light. The powers that be. The Spirit is willing. Fight the good fight. Even words like Passover and scapegoat and atonement were coined by Tyndale to capture biblical concepts. How beautiful was this translation? For his work, he was hunted in Europe as a heretic. Eventually, he was betrayed, arrested, and burned at the stake. And his final words were a loud cry, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And within a few years, God answered Tyndale's prayer. And so here we have the road to the Geneva Bible. One Bible after another was published, came in rapid succession after Tyndale's Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Matthew Bible, the Great Bible. And each built directly off Tyndale's foundational work. Each of them built off his foundational work. And the Great Bible, that Bible, became the first authorized edition placed in almost every parish church across England by royal decree. But then persecution struck the church again. And when the Catholic Queen Mary, or Bloody Mary, came to the throne, public English Bibles were banned, and many English Protestants fled to continental Europe, specifically to Geneva, Switzerland. And it was there something extraordinary happened in Geneva, Switzerland. This was the birth of the Geneva Bible, the Bible that shaped the Puritans. It was published and printed in 1560, produced by these exiles, and became one of the most influential Bibles in the 16th century. It was the Geneva Bible. The Bible was revolutionary for the average reader, absolutely revolutionary. It was the first English Bible to introduce verse numbers, the English Bible to introduce verse numbers. It had cross-references, it had book introductions, it had maps and illustrations, chronologies in the book, and most famously, extensive marginal notes. It was the first ever English study Bible. Study Bibles are great, and the Geneva Bible was the first. Its notes reflected the robust theology of the Protestant Reformation and encouraged believers to understand Scripture for themselves right at their home, and these study Bible notes helped them. And this became the Bible of the Puritans, of William Perkins, of Richard Greenham, of Thomas Cartwright, of all the early Puritans. This was their Bible, and for decades, this was the go-to Bible of the early Puritans. And from there came King James and his new translation. Why was the King James Bible written? Well, in 1604, King James called a Hampton Court conference to address grievances raised by the Puritans that the church was not pure enough. And whilst most Puritan requests were denied, one monumental outcome was the commissioning of a new English Bible translation. A new English Bible translation. And they were encouraged to revise the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, those Bibles, and they revised heavily consulting Tyndale's Bible and the Geneva Bible, but it was a specific King James Bible. And this was a masterpiece finally published in 1611. Interestingly, it contained no marginal notes because King James wasn't particularly happy with some of those notes, especially the marginal notes that would talk about the corruption of maybe kings in this world and authority of kings, that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He didn't like that so much. And at first, the Puritans, they continued reading their Geneva Bible. It was much loved. They loved the study notes. They would read it alongside other commentaries and other notes, but gradually the poetic beauty of the King James translation, its mandatory use in public worship, and the cessation of Geneva printings in England led to the complete dominance of the King James Bible. So by the late 17th century, later Puritans were using the King James Bible, like John Owen, Thomas Brooks, Flavel, Charnock, and others were quoting primarily from the King James Bible. And what we need to remember is that the Puritans, they didn't worship Bible translations. They loved the original languages. It was the original languages that they chose to read and study first, and then seek to read the English translations. And so, the greatest Puritan scholars constantly worked directly with the original texts, and then afterwards would consult English translations and seek to have those English translations in their pulpits. So this is what we must remember. They believed that faithful preaching required careful, rigorous study of the original text and the English text that was in front of them. The English Bible was precious to them, but the Hebrew and Greek scriptures remained the final authority for them. So the conclusion of the story of Bible translations is this. What Bible did the Puritans use? Well, the answer depends on which generation of the Puritans that you are talking about. If you're talking about the early Puritans, they were largely shaped and molded by the Geneva Bible and used it and its study notes extensively. The later Puritans wrote and preached and memorized from the King James Bible while using the Geneva Bible alongside and the original text. Yet both translations were shared with the same type of heartbeat. They stood firmly on the shoulders of William Tyndale, who gave his life for ordinary people that they could read and preach the Bible. The story of the Puritans is not really about a single Bible translation. It's a story of God's faithfulness in preserving his word and raising up courageous translators and preachers and congregants who would bring the scriptures to the next generation. And every time we open up our Bible today, we are direct beneficiaries of that remarkable history that we have. Isn't that great? So let us remember to preach one Christ, by Christ, to the praise of Christ, because that, my friends, that is Puritan preaching. God bless you.